Andrew, thanks again for answering a question for us from one of our sort of church planning community. The question we've got today is it relates to service and culture. So how do you get your service working for the culture that you're working in without the culture then dominating everything at the same time? How did you manage it at EV? Have you managed it at
Yeah,
EV?
yeah. We are constantly reviewing and working on it. Yeah, I think it's a very important issue. But I might just say a couple of things in kind of anticipation of the bigger thing. Culture is a funny thing and it can be dangerous. I think that's part of what you're saying in the question. What I mean by that is one way that you can conceive maturity is that you grow past seeing or caring about externals and superficial things. And a lot of culture, subculture particularly, is expressed in the superficial. Not entirely, not only, but in how someone dresses, in the language they use, in what they do and how they do it, the way their house is furnished. These things are actually expressions of who they are in their culture and their subculture. As you mature, we're meant to actually mature to the point where we care less and less about superficials, and so I don't relate to people anymore on the basis of how they dress, how they speak, what they look like. I see beyond that. And the problem with most leaders is that they're too mature, or they've come to a certain stage of maturity where they don't even see that stuff, they don't care about it anymore, and they think everyone else doesn't care about it or shouldn't care about it.
Yeah.
And we're very concerned to get people to the third place. Do you know that 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul talks about becoming a Jew for the Jew, a Gentile, for the weak, and so on. And I take it what he's talking about is that he himself was a Jew. He was converted out of that, but converted in such a way that the externals of Jewishness and the externals of Greekness and so on, he could become any of those things for the sake of the gospel, because he wasn't so bound by one culture. He could step above it and drop into anywhere else. And I think what we're trying to do with maturing people is to get to the point where they're not constricted and bound by their culture. They're not so enamored of it that they can't let it go. Then we want to get to the point where they're able to let it go and then see it for what it is and then step back into it again without not being enamored of it. Now that's dangerous, very dangerous, because we're conscious here that the more we keep focusing on the superficials of culture, we can reinforce people's superficiality. So we're working hard to try and help people see that we've got to the third place, we're going back for the sake of the weak, for the sake of the superficial. Now, how do we do it? The process is best led by someone who has arrived at that third place, who's risen above and doesn't care, so they don't get consumed and caught up by it. But the problem is getting someone who sees it again clearly enough and sees it enough that they can know how to shape us to be like it without becoming enslaved to it. And so what I did was recognise my own history. So I was someone who grew up on the beach, and so coming to the Central Coast was a natural and easy culture to step into. But my difficulty was that I'd been trained out of that culture. 4 years of Bible college, 4 years in other churches, and I talked differently. I had a different frame of thinking, and so it was not always easy to be back where I once was. And so what I tried to look for were people who were immersed in the culture, build relationship and connection with them, that they could help me see what I was no longer seeing. And I found a couple of those people years ago who constantly griped about our culture. And instead of critiquing them all the time, I sat alongside them and listened hard and tried to hear the critique and start to own and get what they were seeing, to pass it through the grid theologically so that it didn't there were some aspects that they were reacting to were problems for them, really. Trying to tease that apart, and we work pretty hard over that. Lots of tensions in that process, and it's very difficult.
Can I
Then to
butt in
step
this
back and
sec?
think
Can
about,
I just jump in for a sec?
yeah, yeah,
Because the perspective you're starting to talk from now is really. I'm not going to suggest that you've got age on your side, Andrew. Because this is more of a senior pastor's question in a sense that you're going, how am I going to connect back in? What about for someone who is coming into an area, and if you're not familiar like you were with the beach culture, but you've got a heart for an area, it may be very hard to know where to connect in or even to understand what are the cultural markers. How do you find them out? Is it the same thing? Is it kind of finding people who look like they're in touch and making them your savants, so to speak?
I guess that's exactly the point I'm making, is that it's very hard for anyone to step too far out from their culture and connect. And so I think what we all need to find are the people who are right in the culture, who I can connect with by perhaps their conversion, they're converted, they're able to connect to me on the basis of our common share in Jesus. But they're a step closer to the culture I'm wanting to reach. And so that relationship, I think, is very important. Finding people like that's quite critical. So, yeah, you lob into another culture. You do what you can do to get close to them, but you've got to find the people in it who share enough gospel with you that you can have a bridge that you can cross cultures and hear. So I guess what I'm saying is I was able to shape us a little bit down that path, but I was looking for people who were in it who could shape us the next step further. And do that, doing that with me assessing theologically the shape of what was happening and whether we were giving in too much to culture, whether there was a Trojan horse coming in with the cultural baggage. So that's my job. And that's the planter's job, surely too. That's why we want them theologically trained. They have to be guys who can bring a principled theological mind to all of this and not just the superficial reaction, either against the world they've come from or against the world they're going to. They've got to step back into principles.
Yeah. I guess in that respect, on a practical front, that's why it's so important in your planning team, not just to lob in with a team that's actually from a different culture, but rather to be trying to build the team on the ground as well.
It's very hard if you've got too many of you from another culture. Yeah, because transforming and turning that around to be a culture that's acceptable. Because the person from the culture you land into, if they lob into a community that's got, 90% North Shore or Melbourne, Western suburbs or something, kind of a very different culture to you, they'll bounce off. And so one of the strengths that we had was we had very few people outside the Central Coast who joined. There was 4 of us, and the rest were Central Coast locals. Difficult and frustrating and painful because of the shape theologically they had, but very powerful because from the very beginning, the vast majority of people in our church were locals.
Okay, so let me see if I can. Sorry. I was going to say, let me see if I can summarise the beauties of Skype, being able to interrupt each other and then pause and look at each other for a few minutes. Look, so we're talking about culture, that it's a language. It's a language it's really, you've got to learn, but you don't want to be bound by it. And we're talking about people who can actually help you learn that language and learn to speak in it, but again, to be careful of the information that might be being conveyed by the language or the way that you're speaking about it. Is there anything else that you want to tie up for us about like key points for keeping in mind when you're shaping your own church culture to fit inside that culture?
Yeah, well, look, there's a whole bunch of things. We spent a lot of time working on this. I think you've got to look at public spaces that people in your culture use. So where's the spaces they're going to that they like going to? Is it the RSL club? Is it the pub? Is it the surf club? Is it, where are they going to? And are there things about that space that they find comforting? That's important. You don't just look at their homes always too, because a lot of people live in homes where they actually they don't notice that they don't see it. They've not had the skill to shape it the way they'd like it to be. There's other spaces they want to be in, and so finding the space they aspire to like is important. And shopping malls, this kind of thing, the magazines they're reading, what kind of TV shows do they? All that kind of stuff gives you culture insights. I can do some of that, but it's the young guys around me now who are much better at it, and giving them the freedom to create environments that they think particularly connect is, in our context here, it's been very, very important. So, for instance, sometimes we're very precious about the church service and we don't want to change that, and we're careful because of all good theological reasons. So we've given them opportunities to start other things and go for it. Shape it how you want, make it look how you want. And by doing that, I've been in a better position to look at it and see and understand and allow them to bring that back into the rest of our work. And so that's been hugely, I think, powerful for the night services here particularly. And then that's bled back into our morning service, which is a bit more conservative. The music you sing. Music is a powerful cultural expression. Style, speed, tempo, words. As a preacher, as someone who speaks, my humour is a cultural expression. The way I articulate certain words, the illustrations I use are all cultural expressions. And so I listen very carefully to the other guys telling me when it doesn't work in their culture, and be careful not to be precious. You're being too precious about your culture. Well, actually, you're being too precious about your culture, and try and hear each other. It's a lot of work we go through in a very important process. There's a danger in, I guess, if I was lobbing into a more, this is not disrespectful, but a bogan culture. I'd be careful about who I gave the task of reshaping the culture to. You'd want to find someone who knows the culture and has the skills to express the culture that people want to connect to. That's a unique kind of person. You don't just give decoration of the youth hall to the youth guys, because they may not actually create a space that other youth want to come to.
Yeah, actually, there's a lot of theory in relation to that. I mean, I don't mean to put my oar in, but in terms of communication theory, you don't so much develop messages often for the actual audience you're speaking to, but the aspirations of that audience. Teenagers tend to aspire for older 20s, thinking about themselves as sort of like mature age people. So if you build for exactly where they're at, in any respect, you often find that you're hitting something they're not interested in.
Exactly right. It's interesting to me. I've noticed in a lot of modern churches, the more contemporary, often Pentecostal church, their stage is littered with TVs, with plasma TVs and big LCD widescreen TVs. And someone mentioned to me once that they went to a service where there were a lot of TVs on the stage and none of them were being used, or they just had a logo on it or something like this. And it strikes me, I don't know if this is why they're doing it, but it strikes me what they're doing is they're seeking to present the lounge room, the aspirational lounge room almost, the place where people feel comfortable is with that kind of technology, and it makes church feel like it's part of their world, but in a way that is aspirational. It's a space they're attracted to, they want to be part of. Now, of course, you can see straight away the danger, because you can very easily be communicating not just that this space is to make you comfortable, but this is a space that's meant to draw you onto materialism. So you got all these tensions that you need to engage with theologically, and you need people equipped to be able to do that theologically. Yeah.
Well, if you were going to sort of come up with a pithy question you ask yourself every time you look at some new cultural suggestion that somebody brings up to you to sort of think about to make you more relevant or something like that, what do you ask yourself straight away? Is
it a Trojan horse? Is it a Trojan horse? Is it is it an expression of culture that expresses and carries with it something that will destroy and undermine the message I'm conveying? That's always the first thing I'm asking and thinking about. Or is it just cultural and neutral? Is it, is it just a different style that I might feel uncomfortable with? But really, there's nothing behind it that's of great danger to the theological gospel presence in this place. That's always the thing. I get headaches thinking about that kind of stuff.
Well, mate, I'm going to leave you with your headache. If you've got a question for Andrew, we've got an email address coming up on the screen at the moment. We'd really like to hear about what you need to know in basically trying to plant churches in Australia. Thanks again for your time, mate, and we'll see you next time.
Pleasure.